Welcome to the Sky News Daily with me, Tom Cheshire.
What is the solution to liberate people in the concentration camp from Palestine?
Jihad!
What is the solution?
Jihad! Jihad!
Those were the chants at a pro-Palestinian protest this weekend in London. The Metropolitan Police looked at the footage and said it had not identified any offences arising from the specific clip. They said that jihad had a number of meanings, and the Crown Prosecution Service agreed with them. But the government says that chants like that should be met with the full force of the law. Here's Transport Secretary Mark Harper on Sky News this morning.
Well, I saw some of those clips yesterday, and they were very disturbing.
Those chants weren't made at the main protest on Saturday, but at one organised by the extremist Islamist group Hizb ut-Tahrir.
Fight in the way of Allah those who fight you. The Zionist entity has a military. They have a police force. They have a judiciary. They have an apparatus, an army.
Hizb ut-Tahrir is banned in at least 13 countries, including China, Germany, Russia, and in most Muslim-majority nations. But not in the UK, despite several different governments trying to for quite a long time. Here's Gordon Brown's first PMQs in July 2007, being asked by then opposition leader David Cameron about the group.
We need to act against groups which are seeking to radicalise young people. Almost 2 years ago, the government said that it would ban the extremist group Hizb ut-Tahrir. We think it should be banned. Why hasn't it happened?
I have agreed that we will look at this issue, but we need evidence, and the evidence can't be just one or two quotes.
Later, we'll talk about Hizb ut-Tahrir, what it is, what it stands for. But first, we're going to talk about the policing and the politics. Well, Martin Brunt is our crime correspondent. This whole situation, you've got a clear video showing people clearly chanting jihad, and that's pretty much the only clear thing after that, because people disagree on the interpretation, and you have politicians saying they should feel the full force of the law, and then you have the Metropolitan Police saying, we've looked at this, and the CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, has also looked at this, and they don't think an offence has taken place. Does that mean the politicians and the police are far apart on understanding how these sorts of things should be policed at protests?
I don't think that's true at all. In fact, that came up when I was talking to the Commissioner this morning. He made it very clear that we're all on the same side. We all want to and aim to keep everybody safe. So I guess it's just a question of reaching some middle ground. But even there, I think that the Metropolitan Police Commissioner and the Home Secretary are headed in the same direction, that they both think the law should be made tougher. That's going to take some time. You know, that has to be agreed by Parliament. And that could take weeks, months, may even happen beyond a general election. But for now, they obviously have to reach some compromise. And in the words of Suella Braveman, she says that context is critical. And I think context is crucial, she says. And I think that's where the difficulty lies, because, you know, the law in many ways is clear, but she has suggested in a letter to chief constables at the very start of this conflict and the fallout here, that officers should make fine judgments, if you like, when things are happening in front of them. And I think that's really where the difficulty lies, asking individual officers to assess the context on a complicated, sometimes complicated area of law in the midst of a potentially volatile situation is a lot to ask of individual officers.
How difficult does that make for police officers having to make those very fine judgments in the midst of these very, very big protests, which presumably are going to keep happening over the next few weeks and months?
Life is going to become more and more difficult, and there will be much more criticism of not just the Metropolitan Police for the way they tackle these rallies, protests, demonstrations, but for other police forces. You know, we've seen similar demonstrations in other parts of the country. The police have operational primacy. You know, the politicians keep saying that operational matters are clearly decisions for police officers, and I think the police will have to not fumble, but feel their way very carefully through subsequent protests. And it may be that some protesters who do want to stray into criminality might use this fallout, if you like, between ministers, government ministers and the police over interpreting the law. They might use that to their advantage and push things even further.
And that's a really interesting point, because the other thing to bear in mind, this is tricky. As you say, it's a fine judgment. But the Commissioner also talking about the arrests that have been made after protests. There have been clear-cut cases so far, haven't there?
He said today, when I interviewed him,
I think the law that we've designed around hate crime and terrorism over recent decades hasn't taken full account of the ability of extremist groups to steer around those laws and propagate some pretty toxic messages through social media. And those lines probably need redrawing.
it's the bigger issues, the incitement to racial hatred or incitement to racial violence, or even ultimately glorifying terror, that are the really big issues that the politicians are absolutely adamant should not be tolerated in any way.
That context is going to continue to be crucial. So many different questions and opinions around it. Martin, thank you so much for joining us today. After the break, we'll focus on the group at the centre of these chants, Hizb ut-Tahrir.
I'm sure people are hearing about them for the first time.
Duncan Gardam is a journalist who specialises in terrorism, extremism and international security. He's been following groups like Hizb ut-Tahrir for years.
Essentially, they're a group that haven't been in the mainstream, if you like, of either Islamist activism or even in the mainstream of that kind of radical element that we're most concerned about. This is a group that has been seen really over the last few years, in the last 20 years that we've been dealing with this problem, as a bit of a stepping stone, if you like, something that individuals have participated in and then gone on to join other more radical groups. And essentially, the group that has caused us most concern, which is called Al-Muhajirun, is an offshoot of Hizb ut-Tahrir that seems to support violent activism and on those grounds has been banned from the UK. But Hizb ut-Tahrir has always stayed on the non-violent side of their rhetoric and on those grounds hasn't been banned.
And on that non-violent side, and I think that speaks directly to the heart of this debate, the sound of people chanting jihad, 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 and the police arguing there are multiple meanings to this, which of course there are, but in the context, it means a different thing if this is a group that is opposed to, they say, violent struggle.
Their aim is to establish an Islamic state in the UK and internationally, but they don't advocate violence to achieve those ends. Their essence really, and their sense in which they're problematic for the UK government, is that they don't agree with democracy. They believe that an Islamic system would not be compatible with democracy, which of course is against how the majority of Muslims see their participation in civil and political life in the UK. And so Hizb ut-Tahrir have been accused of trying to split people off from that mainstream, from that participation route that everybody wants Muslims and people in general to be involved in political life, having a voice, taking part, making sure that their feelings and their concerns are heard. Hizb ut-Tahrir is really saying, well, no, we need a whole new system, and that needs to be an Islamic system.
It's dwindled since the early 2000s, the heyday, perhaps in the wake of the Iraq invasion and war. Has that been the case? It's become less and less relevant, and suddenly they're back in the spotlight this weekend.
Hizb ut-Tahrir has always been around and about, and if you like, it's been active in student circles over the years, and there's a reason in a sense for that, because a lot of their rhetoric is around establishing Islamic governmental system, talk an awful lot about how an Islamic government would operate if it was established in the UK. It did cause real problems in the early 2000s, and we saw a number of individuals who had been members of Hizb ut-Tahrir going on to do quite serious things. And the first instance of that was Britain's first suicide bombers, who, interestingly, I suppose from my perspective, blew themselves up on behalf of Hamas in Israel. Certainly one of them blew themselves up and the other one was subsequently found drowned in the ocean. Those two individuals really marked that first stepping over that line in the UK in 2003, 2 years after 9/11, but 2 years before 7/7. And then 21/7 bombers had participated in Hizb ut-Tahrir marches, and the subsequent attack on Glasgow Airport, which people may remember the flaming Jeep being driven into the airport. Those two individuals were also linked to Hizb ut-Tahrir. So it had a concerning history, and that's why that clip that you've heard about Gordon Brown, Tony Blair, David Cameron, all three prime ministers considering banning Hizb ut-Tahrir, but actually didn't follow through on that.
You mentioned those attacks just then, the associations with this organisation, prime ministers wanting to ban it. It is banned, in many other countries. It's banned in Europe, but it's also banned in Muslim majority countries. Why was the UK not able to do that, even though that's what successive prime ministers wanted to do?
So the essence on prescribing, as we call it under the UK legislation, is that an organisation should have proven links to violence and to the advocation for violent overthrow of the British system. That doesn't seem to be the case with Hizb ut-Tahrir, and it's worth pointing out that some of these individuals, less so the individuals that blew themselves up at Mike's Place in Israel, but certainly they had moved on to Hamas, and in the Glasgow Airport case, they had moved on to be operating under the auspices of Al-Qaeda and had met up with Al-Qaeda operatives. The same is true of the 21/7 bombers. So all of those individuals, although they may have started and in some cases been quite involved with Hizb ut-Tahrir, had then moved on to other organisations in order to seek the authority that they wanted for violent action.
Is it that it's difficult technically in terms of how do you actually define this? Or is this actually, when you've had people like David Anderson, the independent review of counter-terrorism legislation, coming back and saying, well, look, we don't like these ideas. Most people wouldn't agree with this and we might find them abhorrent, but they should be defeated by debate. They should be allowed to be aired because it's not inciting violence. Is it a sort of moral, philosophical question of free speech, or is it actually, it just becomes so hard to draft this stuff that you'd never get anywhere? You'd end up accidentally banning lots of other things we'd all think should be said, perhaps.
Yes, it could have an incredibly cooling effect on people that are outside of the mainstream political opinion. And of course, one of the things that people are keen to do in the modern environment with the internet and the proliferation of voices from the fringes really is to try and learn how to take on those voices and how to tackle those voices rather than push them out. It is worth pointing out here, I think, Tom, that there's a difference here, if you like, between saying jihad is calling for violence and saying that we don't really like what Hizb ut-Tahrir is saying. And I think the argument can get somewhat muddled. If you think that call for jihad was a call for violence, then that is already illegal. If you think Hizb ut-Tahrir were calling for a Palestinian resistance, that's a different issue really in many ways. Or if they were supporting Hamas and terrorism and violence, that absolutely is already illegal. If they're talking about Palestinian resistance or the desire to establish an Islamic state, that is not banned. And it's a very interesting argument about whether it should or not.
The Met have looked at this and said, we don't see any reason to investigate. The CPS, the Crown Prosecution Service, have said the same thing. But clearly the government do, and now they're saying, well, we need a change of law. Where do you think that line is? Do you think the police got it right?
It's a really difficult one because I think it could easily be seen in either context. And jihad, without question, is referred to by most Muslims as a struggle. It is part of that, part of the principles of Islam is that you should participate in jihad, that you should struggle and strive to achieve what God should want you to achieve. Now, violent Islamists believe that jihad is a violent struggle. You have to kind of look at a lot of material around it. And I spend a lot of my time looking at people using the word jihad when it's really crystal clear the context it's being used in. But perhaps in this case, the police certainly have taken the view that it's not as clear as it would need to be if they were going to bring a prosecution. And I can see their point in some ways, because what's worse than to put somebody on trial for something of this nature and to see that trial collapse in fairly short order.
Are they getting more attention than perhaps they're worth? Can you give us an idea of the size of their organisation now compared to how it used to be? I mean, how influential are we talking?
I think its heyday is probably past. I mean, as some people will remember, some of the individuals that had been part of Hizb ut-Tahrir in the late 90s and early 2000s suddenly realizing that this organization really wasn't one that could function side by side with British life as a Muslim. And somebody called Ed Hussein wrote a book called The Islamist, which described his journey away from Hizb ut-Tahrir. And he wasn't the only one. There have been quite a few other individuals who have been former members of Hizb ut-Tahrir and then have decided that it's time to move on and participate in Islamic life in Britain in a more positive fashion. Certainly marching now is again, drawing them attention, but part of the reason for that is to look at the touchstone of the Palestinian cause and how that does rile up certain factions of British Islamist community, and certainly Hizb ut-Tahrir as an organization originally founded in Jerusalem and with close ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, who also have ties to Hamas. This is an issue for which they feel very strongly. So that is why they're to the fore as much as anything, and why they're then suddenly able to mobilize much larger numbers than would normally participate in their study circles on a regular basis, which may really only be 100 or a couple of hundred people.
What is their position on Israel itself? Is it close to what Hamas think, that it shouldn't exist? Where does it sit on that spectrum?
Well, as an organization that believes in an Islamic state, a Muslim state across the whole world, Hizb ut-Tahrir clearly believe that Israel should be part of an Islamic state and that the Palestinian land should be restored to the Palestinian people, a situation that existed before 1948. So they clearly do believe in that. But that's not quite the same as that Hamas call for the destruction of Israel. It's more a campaign of defiance and if you like, justice for the Palestinian people as they see it.
And that's it for the Sky News Daily. Sarah Jane Mee and Sophie Ridge will be taking over for the next few episodes. Back again tomorrow.
Hello, I'm Jack Blanchard.
And I'm Sam Cates.
And we're inviting you to our homes every Sunday to give you the lowdown on what to expect in the political week ahead.
Westminster Politics is all about getting ahead of the game, so that's what we're going to try and bring you. An essential briefing packed with all the information you need to start the week.
From Politico and Sky News, this is Politics at Jack and Sam's, available every Sunday evening wherever you get your podcasts.